So, if as you can conclude from this title, so we are moving back to Anatolia, but now to the more western and the central parts than it was. So with hieroglyphic Luwian, and now more decidedly into the first millennium before Christus. So my talk will consist basically of two parts. So the first part will be a more or less technical and detailed discussion of several letters of the Phrygian alphabet. And the second part, I will, so to say, come to the wider perspective of the Anatolian alphabets, as I think so this technical discussion of the several letters quite unexpectedly opens a window into the workings of the formation of the Anatolian alphabets and the problem of interrelation between them. So this is the Phrygian alphabet. I think it's so the large part of it is quite familiar to almost everybody here, because well, the more than 2/3 of it consist of the familiar letters of the Greek alphabet, so corresponding more or less exactly, so with some slight differences, as for example in delta, so which is sometimes is baseless, so to say, and of course there are some slight variations in later shapes, but no big deal. So the most prominent unusual feature of the Phrygian alphabet is the presence of the special letter for non-syllabic e, that is y. In this case, Phrygian is definitely different from Greek, as Greek use the same letter for both e and y, so without distinction. So but there are some other letters whose meaning is not so clear until now, and even in the discussion in the recent book by Obrador Korsak did not clarify the question completely. I would almost say on the opposite. So these are these letters. One should note, however, that just enumerating these letters and representing them as such is a little bit misleading. So by far not of them are as real as some others. For example, so this sign is attested only by 2 graffiti, and so both are problematic. So in terms of reading. And probably so it's just non-existent letters. On the other hand, so this sign again, it's the attested on in a very small number of texts, including one quite clear case where it renders definitely simply b, found in other instances. And both these facts and some interesting, curious shape found in another graffito. So the same eight-figure letter, so with additional vertical hasta, shows that it's simply a peculiar mode of writing of b. So there is nothing especially interesting on that. So just a graphical variant. So I will be talking about these letters. So basically, first of all, about 19 and 20, and then so about 23, well, which is tested also only by a couple of inscriptions. Besides that, I will add a new variant of what I think might be the early alternative variant of the same letter, which has a number 20. So as I already mentioned, so the phonetic value of this letter is not quite well defined until now. But the so to say the working hypothesis, well, the working hypothesis already for 40 years, 40 something years, is that it's sort of Xen, and so this idea goes back to Michel Lejeune, who formulated it, so who based it on the basically three cases. Although, yes, I should mention, so the actual attestations of this letter are a little bit more numerous. So it's about 20, but mostly, well, almost 10 of them is found on in the context of just graffiti, one letter graffiti on a potsherd. So there is nothing useful in that. So Lejeune based his proposal on three cases. So one of them is graffiti from Gordian, which looks like that. And Lejeune observed that so the central part is, as you can see, is well, quite peculiar. Is basically, so we're dealing with a correction, and he thought that so the initial letter was so the psi-like letter, and then it was corrected to S, to sigma. In fact, well, so I basically agree on that, and so almost everybody agreed on that for a long time. Well, I would say that the distinction is inverse. Is in fact, so I was able to examine quite a good photo from the Gordian archive, and also the inscription itself behind the glass in the Ankara Museum, and it looks like so the scribe, if you prefer, he scratched first sigma, and then so very persistently corrected it into psi-like sign, so that so nobody would doubt that it's indeed this sign. And so this interchange or correction suggests that so the psi-like sign has something to do with the sibilant. So the second instance is so this graffiti, again from Gordian, so which uses twice the same letter, and so traditionally it was identified, well, first of all, triggered by the Greek form of the name, so with the Median, or of the name of the Median king of the late 7th and 6th century, Kyaxares. So with which the name indeed demonstrates some well, some resemblance. First of all, in the Greek form, and in the form of Old Persian form, which is also attested, Uwachshafra is actually already a little bit different. But in any case, well, the acceptance of this argument is so the wide acceptance of this argument is a little bit surprising. So because, well, so nobody seems to actually ask why the name of the Median king would be found on a just normal potsherd from Gordian of unclear dating. And in fact, so as a matter of fact, so in Gordian we do not have many foreign names at all, neither Greek nor Iranian, nor well, other identifiable other than simply Phrygian. Okay, so the last argument so was based on the well-known inscription. So this is the part of the so-called Ariastis inscription. So the part B, and so the letter is found there in the word, well, something like da et. So in this phrase, and Lejeune suggested that so we are dealing with the verb, well-attested verb of the Phrygian corpus, actually. So one of the few about whose meaning so we can be sure. So it's the to make. So because it well-attested in the Neo-Phrygian inscriptions in the standard formula, so to make kakon adaket, which means so to make something harmful, so to make something bad. And so in his reading it was duxed. In fact, so the reading is patently problematic, as is virtually refuted by the evidence of the very same inscription itself. Because we do have in another word of this inscription, so the combination kse, spelled with 2 letters. In fact, Lejeune, of course, knew that, and he tried to explain it as in the difference, so in spelling 1 letter against 2 letters, by morphological consideration. To be honest, so the argument is well, a little bit lame. So because it's from the syntax of the inscription is clear, so that the forms should be related. So it should be actually 2 forms, well, with the perspective or future meaning. So the containing so the element se or set as commonly defined. So the explanation is problematic, and then so just 10 years ago, so another graffiti was discovered on the beams of the tumulus MM, so which again features the combination kis spelled with 2 letters. So actually, so this explanation basically the Lejeune's interpretation of the letter cannot be true. On the other hand, so the Bartolomeo Obrador Corsac, in his book on Phrygian, also discussed this letter quite dedicating quite some pages to it. He also dismissed the interpretation of Lejeune and proposed his own interpretation, which I found, however, even less convincing. He based his consideration basically on the another instance, which is found on the Graffita 249. So this is the Graffita. So just to show you briefly, and he interpreted it so he connected the initial sequence which he read following the editors of the inscription, again Lejeune and Brix, as se the letter L, and connected with the Semitic word for weight, shekel, which is also known from Greek as siglos and siglos. Well, this is very problematic because I think this object is basically written in neither in Phrygian nor in Greek nor in Ugaritic or Egyptian or not even in Japanese, because I think this is simply an imitation of writing. So basically, it's very not extremely common, but quite common thing in the in ancient Anatolia and elsewhere. So when one tries to imitate writing, so to provide it with some symbolical or magic meaning. So not a single letter of this thing can be read, and so neither the reading sekel nor any other reading can be actually defended. So I think the actual value of this thing for deciphering the letter is exactly 0. He also was Obrador Corsac was able also to use another inscription, which is much more pertinent. And so this is the also quite recently discovered inscription from Bithynia. And so the letter is found there at the end, so in what looks like a verb. Obrador Cossack proposed, so they compared in general inscription to compared with the Aramaic counterparts found in the same region. The Aramaic, I mean, so the Empire Aramaic Persian inscriptions. And he suggested that so the final sentence is connected so with a sort of curse formula and or imprecation in this case, and can be interpreted like "let nobody harm Manes." And he proposed to connect so to identify the root as waps and propose some etymological connection, which again evidently not compelling. I will return so to these cases a little bit later, but I would start so my own proposal argument for the reading of the letter. So with another case, which is was not identified so far. It is found on a bowl, which is currently in the Geneva. Unfortunately, I was not able to reach it, but still photo is good enough, barely good enough, so to claim that so the initial reading is not quite correct. Not quite correct in one small detail in the first letter of the very first word. So I hope you can see it. So the first letter, and it is even on this photo you can see it is not quite the same as sigma, which is the sixth letter, surgas toi, and it actually consists of 3 strokes: 1, 2, and 3. So we basically dealing with a slightly different spelling of this word. So it doesn't change the interpretation because so the sequence is so striking so that one cannot doubt it. So it's definitely so the word is represents the same name and quite probably in the exactly the same meaning in which it is attested in the Greek inscriptions as an epithet or epithet which become a name of Zeus, Surgastes. So here you can see the different attestation of this epithet, quite widely distributed in the Mediterranean, but yes, with a certain preference to the Bithynia. Moreover, the word is also attested in Lydian. And in Lydian, so it is attested in not quite clear context in one long inscription. So in combination, which might imply that we are dealing with a personal name, which is not quite impossible if we take into consideration the gloss of Hesychius, onoma barbarikon. Well, it's not quite clear, so what sort of onoma he means, but probably personal name rather than divine name. And so the other one is on the fragmentary inscription, so which might be connected with some dedication, so it might be a divine name, but in any case doesn't change anything. So we have the same word written slightly differently. What is interesting, so and in this writing is that so Lydian uses not just usual S. It uses the letter for sort of palatal sign, for palatal sound, or what might be alveolar S. In any case, something closer to S or Si. Probably not exactly sh, if as you may conclude from this not very fitting transliteration. And this is quite interesting, which suggests something about phonetics of the word also in Phrygian. So now we have, so along with the initial graffito, with the correction of S to this letter, so we have another instance which suggests that so the letter renders simply as sibilant. And well, we can take up this as a working hypothesis, which is a priori not quite unlikely, as there are some other instances, as in Anatolia elsewhere, so which would show that so there are alphabets which use two signs for sibilants. So the first observation which one can make is that it's especially frequently attested in the position before u, and which suggests that we might be dealing with the phonetic variant of sibilant conditioned by the following u sign. So given the Lydian spelling, so we might assume that it can be the sort of alveolar sound or palatal sound. And this would mean that Phrygian U may be in fact U, as in Greek. On the other hand, so we do have several important instances when the letter is used not before U. And, but also, as in these cases, we might actually argue that the reading it as a sort of sibilant fits very well. So if we look a little bit closer into the context of this inscription, we can see that so actually the meaning to make doesn't fit really into the context, because it is used with a name as a direct object. In fact, so the what we can deduce from the context implies rather that we are dealing with the verb to put or set. So to set his own name in the sense as to replace name, which is a common topic in Anatolia. So the fear of being robbed by somebody by replacing name in inscription is a very usual thing. So in fact, so we can interpret it as das set, simply as das set, and this form finds support in some Neo-Phrygian material. So we have the das cd, which is obviously based on the same root da. So to set, and of course, yeah, I should mention that yes, so the root da to set is well tested in general in Phrygian, and even more frequent parallel we have in the form totoseti, so which is prospective, again prospective or future form, so based on the Phrygian counterpart of the Greek didomi, so to give, and so. Also, for the Bithynian inscription, we can propose also quite even more strikingly appropriate thing. So, if we read the verb in question as simply aniasiti, it sounds almost like Greek, with the almost not quite exactly. Because of the ending, but the form of the verb is almost exactly corresponds to aniazo, aniao, which perfectly fits in the meaning. So it means grieve or distress. It's quite a rare verb, but still, why not? And it fits quite well into the interpretation proposed actually by Obrador-Kursak himself. So about harming. So basically, probably we're dealing with the formula prohibiting to make some harm, or so to distress or to disturb. So this stele or the guy who's under the stele. So it's the, I will not go into the detail about the interpretation of Smani as a personal name or a name of the monument. However, probably even more important argument comes from the fact, from the situation which we have in the West Phrygian alphabet. So in the West Phrygian alphabet, we have two letters for slightly different sibilants. so which quite conventionally rendered by S and so S with a small dot on top of it. So the exact distinction is not quite clear, but the fact remains. So the West Phrygian alphabet uses two of them. So I would conclude, so the evidence is not especially rich, but still quite sufficient to conclude that we are dealing so with a letter corresponding to sort of emphatic S, probably first of all palatal S, but not only, probably just a different sibilant. And of course, as I already mentioned, so the same situation we have in Lydian, also in Sidetic, and in a slightly different way in Greek. So we have several letters for sibilants. But this is probably not the end of the story of this letter, as I think so one can identify in two inscriptions only, unfortunately. So the very early variant, very aberrant and very early variant of the same letter. So it found, first of all, in the Phrygian inscription from Kerkenes, and it was identified by the editor of the inscription, Claude Brix again, as a word divider. Again, so this interpretation is fails to convince. First of all, because we do have a word divider in the same inscription in the lower part, in another fragment. So in general, it's true that this inscription is not especially rich in word dividers, but still one finds one, and it corresponds to the just normal Phrygian word divider. And of course, it would be good so to have it as a word divider if uva would make some sense in Phrygian, but it does not make sense. And this sequence is so short that one gets the suspicion that it's something different. And in fact, so the same thing, so to say, is found in another inscription, very early inscription, in another graffiti from the same beam of the tumulus MM. As you can see, so on this photo, so it's taken from a quite particular angle. So because it was quite difficult to get to the inscription from the to the graffiti. So in the tumulus, which is still intact. But you can see, so it is incised deep enough and precisely before the first letter, so not to be taken as something different. So it is quite obviously a letter. And of course, two cases, it's not too much, but it is very striking. So in both cases, so this letter is found before U. So in other words, in exactly the same position in which we quite frequently find the psi-like letter. So I would suggest that so we are dealing with indeed a very early variant of the same letter, invented well at a different location. So as we might think, given the Kerkenes inscription, but probably so just a regional or chronological variant of it. Okay, so I move to another case. So it's much simpler, and I'm even a little bit surprised that one has not proposed a just normal transliteration of this letter, because the situation is more or less clear. So almost everybody seems to agree that it should be a sort of affricate. So because it appears regularly before E and E. So you can see here the list of the attestations, and on the one hand, so it's depositionally quite associated with E. On the other hand, so we have some interesting spelling variations, synchronical spelling variation, which suggests. And first of all, this is the information of evidence of one of the bowls from Bayender, which feature only one name, Ates. And so on the one bowl, one finds the writing Atses, which looks like a redundant spelling of the same name. So with this letter and with the additional s to indicate that it was assimilated. On the other hand, so we have also the sequence Atsion, which is again suspiciously reminiscent of one of the most usual and common Phrygian names, Attis. So it might be again assimilated variant of the same name, Atsis or Adzis. So depending on the what was the initial form. And then so we have also some other evidence, onomastic evidence, which is a little bit weaker, but most importantly, so we do have the Greek Zeta used in the Neo-Phrygian inscriptions. So it is clear that the sound was present in Phrygian. So whatever is its exact origin, it looks like we do have this sound, and so we can attribute the early Phrygian letter to this sound. So just briefly, this very rare variant of the same letter may be found on some graffiti. So you can see again. So the material is not especially rich. But the better candidate for this letter would be again S than Z or Z, so we can, at least in one case, we can tentatively compare the sequence S star with the usual verb S star S, so to set to place. Okay, so now as briefly as possible, so go to the wider outlook, and so we'll discuss what does it mean, so the interpretation of this letter for the history of the Anatolian alphabets. First of all, we have the letter of the almost exactly the same form which I discussed a moment ago in Pamphylian alphabet, and it used its phonetic value is well established because it's used in the word for the mistress, Vanassa, and so Vanassa per guy, and it is used exactly in the position in which one finds later this geminate writing of S, of sigma. And in fact, curiously, so that Deike many years ago suggested that we are dealing with the variant of psi, of the Greek psi, which looked plausible from the graphical point of view, but quite strange from the point of view of phonetics. Now we can actually dismiss from this scheme the Greek psi and make a connection with the Phrygian letter, which has exactly the same value. And of course, the not too different letter is found also in the western parts of Anatolia, and so usually called Sampi. And so there is some slight difference, of course, in the writing, but not first of all in the position of the horizontal stroke. And again, so it's well known that the letter stands in the position in which one finds in later inscriptions from the same region or in literary works geminate S. And in Attic dialect, it would be geminate T. So one thought usually that this difference in writing, even in the 6th century, would indicate that we're dealing with slightly different sounds, and so on taking into consideration this double reflex of this sound as a S in Ionic and a T in Attic. So one would think that it's something like Ts. I think so. Now we should reconsider this idea. Well, because we do have just at the same time, so the in the neighboring region, so the letter which has the just the same phonetic value as it is in Ionian, just s, strong sibilant. So we probably do not need to reconstruct anything beyond that. And so conclude that so the Ionian alphabet just used the letter also known in the neighboring regions. Okay, so that might have some reflections on the problem of the writing of the name of Sappho, but I will skip it so because the time is running out. In Lydian, so in Lydian we do have so now the second case, so the arrow-like letter, so which is a little bit different thing and probably demonstrates a different mechanism. So in Lydian we do have so the same arrow-like sign, and in fact one thought that it might be also an affricate. So the evidence is arguably very slim. So we do have these four cases, which is basically exclusively etymological considerations, and so they are. Well, it is clear that it's probably not too far from dental, but what sort of dental is much more difficult to say. Then again, in Carian alphabet, we do have the same letter, so or I would say the sign of the same shape. And again, so it was suggested that it might stand for an affricate. So the evidence is again not very rich, but still stronger because we do have in a bilingual case, and so in Egyptian is something like cha. So it might be palatal affricate. And in fact, so it would be quite possible. So also from the point of view of historical Anatolian phonology. Then in a third alphabet we have so if one counts also Phrygian, also in the fourth alphabet in Anatolia we do have the letter of the same shape. Attested only, well, basically in two words, so it might be affricate, but it is not clear beyond any doubt. So so to conclude, so what we can glimpse from these well observations of the on the first glance liminal and insignificant letters in Phrygian alphabet. In fact, quite interesting things. So the initial fails, the wholesale borrowing of the bulk of letters is the usual thing. So which one usually deals with? Yes. So the Greeks borrowed alphabet from Phrygians. So one discusses where exactly. When exactly, and so on, but that's something already well, on the one hand, quite discussed question. On the other hand, so we do not have new evidence on that, so there is no big point of talking about that again. But the Anatolian evidence tells something about the next phase, so the so-called liberation phase. So when I think so one involved another process and invention of new letters for missing phonetic elements, as for example, so the strong S or some particular kind of sibilant present in Greek or in Phrygian. Of course, the same we have also in Greek. So there are several letters which are not so easily derivable from the Semitic model, and so exactly the same process of elaboration of new elements went at some point in Greek as well. And then, so the case of the arrow-like letter might suggest so the next thing. I do not want so to take this evidence too far away, so because it might be a circular argument, so we want to see behind the arrow-like letter, so the affricate, and so we are imposing this value for all alphabets, which might be dangerous. And so the evidence of the Carian and Sidetic alphabets, so in which we have actually these two systems profoundly different, or at least reshuffled, shows that the relying simply on graphical similarity is not a good way. So I would like to open to leave this question open. So one, if one looks on the map, how it happened, it looks like the Phrygians played in this role one of the central roles, as first of all, so one can think that Phrygian and Lydian, and of course northwest Anatolian part, represented a sort of, well, more or less homogeneous alphabetic province. Of course, there were differences as always, but still the number of similarities between the Phrygian and Lydian alphabet are much greater than, for example, between Phrygian and Carian. And of course, quite interesting case is the similarity between Phrygian and Pamphylian alphabets, which might interestingly suggest something about the population movement from western parts into Pamphylia. Okay, and so we have some bibliography on the problems which I discussed, and well, it remains only to thank you for your attention. I'm sorry about trespassing my time.